Washington, D.C., November 1934. Major General Smedley Darlington Butler sits before a congressional committee. For more than 30 years, Butler had been a United States Marine. He fought in China, Central America, the Caribbean, and France. He had been wounded in battle, decorated again and again, and twice awarded the Medal of Honor. He was one of the most famous Marines in America. But Butler wasn't sitting before Congress to talk about war. He was there to tell them about a conversation that sounded almost impossible. According to Butler, a group of wealthy businessmen and financiers wanted to build an organization of hundreds of thousands of veterans. They wanted Butler to lead it. And they wanted that army to march on Washington. The President of the United States was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The country was drowning in the Great Depression. Banks had collapsed. Millions were unemployed. Labor unrest was spreading. And across the Atlantic, democracy itself appeared to be losing ground. Mussolini ruled Italy. Hitler had seized power in Germany. Fascism was no longer an idea being discussed in books. It was happening. And according to the man sitting before Congress, there were powerful Americans who thought something like it might work here. The newspapers would eventually give the allegation a name: the business plot. But Smedley Butler had another word for what he believed they were asking him to do: fascism. And if his story was true, one of the strangest political conspiracies in American history had just collided with perhaps the worst possible man they could have chosen to lead it. Because Smedley Butler had spent his life fighting wars for powerful men. And by 1934, he had begun to understand exactly who those wars had really been for. This is the story of Smedley Butler and the plot to overthrow a president. To understand why anyone would approach Smedley Butler with a plan this extraordinary, you have to understand who Smedley Butler was. And in 1934, there were few military men in America with a resume like his. Butler joined the United States Marine Corps in 1898. He was 16 years old. And almost immediately, America gave him wars to fight. He served during the Spanish-American War. He fought in the Philippines, China, Haiti, Nicaragua, Mexico, and France. By the end of his career, Butler had served more than 3 decades in the Marine Corps, risen to the rank of Major General, and become one of the most decorated Marines in American history. He received the Medal of Honor, twice, but medals only explain part of why Butler mattered. His men loved him. He had a reputation for sharing their hardships, sleeping where they slept, eating what they ate, and leading from the front. They called him Old Gimlet Eye. He was blunt, profane, charismatic, and famous. And Butler was hardly some revolutionary outsider. He came from a prominent Pennsylvania family. His father, Thomas Stalker Butler, served in Congress for more than 3 decades, and for years chaired the House Committee on Naval Affairs. Smedley Butler knew the American establishment. He had grown up around it. He had served it. And for most of his adult life, he had fought for it. But something happened after Butler retired from the Marine Corps. He began looking differently at the wars he had fought, and at the powerful interests that had benefited from them. And then came the Great Depression. In 1932, thousands of World War I veterans descended on Washington. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force. History remembers them as the Bonus Army. Congress had promised veterans a bonus for their wartime service, but the money wasn't scheduled to be paid until 1945. Now the country was collapsing. Men who had fought in France were unemployed. Their families were hungry. And they wanted their money early. So they came to Washington. They built camps, and they waited. Smedley Butler went to see them. He walked through their camp, spoke with the veterans, ate with them, and encouraged them to stand together. He told them that they had every right to demand that their government hear them. Then President Herbert Hoover ordered the camps cleared. Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur sent troops into the streets. Cavalry advanced. Tear gas filled the air, and the veterans' camps were burned. The images horrified much of the country. But something else had become clear. Thousands of angry veterans could be mobilized, and Smedley Butler was the kind of man that they might listen to. That mattered, because the men who would eventually approach Butler weren't looking for some obscure retired officer. They needed someone veterans would follow. Someone with credibility. Someone with a famous name. Someone who could stand in front of thousands of angry former soldiers and command their attention. Smedley Butler was almost perfect. There was just one problem. By the time they found him, Smedley Butler had begun to change. To understand what Smedley Butler said happened next, you have to understand the world of 1934. Because democracy did not look particularly secure. Across Europe, fascism was rising. Benito Mussolini had ruled Italy for more than a decade. Adolf Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany in 1933. And within months, began dismantling German democracy. Political opponents were arrested. Trade unions were crushed. Power was concentrated in the state. And to some wealthy Americans watching from across the Atlantic, the results could look disturbingly attractive. Fascism promised order, stability, an answer to communism, and perhaps most importantly, an answer to organized labor. This wasn't happening in some distant political universe. American newspapers reported on Mussolini. American businessmen traveled to Europe. Politicians, industrialists, and intellectuals openly debated whether democracy could survive the economic crisis. The Great Depression had shaken confidence in institutions across the world, and the United States was experiencing a crisis of its own. Banks had failed. Businesses had collapsed. Millions were unemployed. Then came Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. Roosevelt's government intervened in the economy on a scale Americans had rarely seen. Banking reforms, public works programs, relief for the unemployed, new efforts to strengthen workers' ability to organize. To millions of struggling Americans, Roosevelt offered hope. But some wealthy Americans saw something very different. They saw an expanding federal government, a president willing to regulate business, a growing labor movement, and policies that threatened an economic order from which they had benefited enormously. And according to Smedley Butler, some powerful interests wanting to do something about it. The plan Butler eventually described wasn't necessarily to storm the White House, drag Roosevelt from the Oval Office, and declare a dictatorship. It was more sophisticated than that. Butler said the conspirators envisioned creating an enormous organization of veterans, possibly hundreds of thousands strong, with Butler as its leader. That organization would descend on Washington and pressure Roosevelt into accepting a new government official, a powerful secretary or administrator who could effectively take control of the executive branch. Roosevelt could remain president. He could cut ribbons, give speeches, smile for the cameras. But real power would belong somewhere else. And if Roosevelt refused, according to Butler, they believed they could force him out. The language surrounding the proposal was carefully chosen. They didn't call it a dictatorship. They talked about protecting the Constitution, saving the country, restoring stability. But Butler believed he understood what he was being asked to build. He had seen powerful interests operate overseas. He had watched governments manipulated in the name of American business. And now, something that looked frighteningly familiar was being proposed at home. But before anyone mentioned overthrowing a president, before anyone talked openly about an army of veterans, before Butler ever walked into a congressional hearing room, a man came to visit him. His name was Gerald MacGuire. His name was Gerald C. MacGuire. He was a bond salesman, a former commander in the Connecticut American Legion. And in the summer of 1933, he showed up at Smedley Butler's home. MacGuire told Butler he represented a group of veterans concerned about the direction of the American Legion. He wanted Butler to travel to the Legion's upcoming national convention in Chicago and deliver a speech. The subject? The gold standard. Specifically, a resolution calling for the United States to return to the gold-backed currency. But there was a problem. Smedley Butler knew almost nothing about monetary policy, and he told MacGuire so. MacGuire had an answer. The speech was already written. Butler only had to deliver it. That immediately made him suspicious. So Butler started asking questions. Who had written the speech? Who was behind this? And why did they need him? According to Butler, MacGuire was reluctant to say, but he kept coming back. And eventually, the conversation became even stranger. MacGuire told Butler there were powerful interests behind the government. He suggested there was plenty of money available. At one meeting, according to Butler's later testimony, MacGuire showed him bank books containing tens of thousands of dollars. Butler wanted to know where the money came from. MacGuire wouldn't give him a satisfactory answer. Then Butler decided to test him. If these people really had the kind of financial backing MacGuire claimed, Butler wanted to see it. According to Butler, he told MacGuire he would need a substantial amount of money immediately. MacGuire left and returned with cash. Butler was now convinced of at least one thing. Whoever was behind MacGuire had access to serious money. But Butler still refused to give the speech, and the American Legion convention went ahead without him. There, a resolution supporting the gold standard was introduced anyway. But MacGuire wasn't finished. Over the following months, he continued meeting with Butler. Then in 1934, MacGuire traveled to Europe. When he returned, he wanted to talk about something he had seen overseas. Veterans, organized into political movements. In France, MacGuire had observed groups of former soldiers being used as a powerful political force. And according to Butler, MacGuire believed something similar could be built in the United States. A massive organization, hundreds of thousands of veterans, well-funded, disciplined, and capable of applying enormous pressure on Washington. But such an organization would need a leader. Not a politician, not a banker, not some millionaire industrialist. It needed a soldier. Someone famous. Someone veterans trusted. Someone who could convince thousands of former servicemen that they weren't overthrowing their government, they were saving it. And Gerald MacGuire believed he had found that man. Smedley Butler. According to Butler, MacGuire told him the organization could raise an army of as many as 500,000 veterans. Money would not be a problem. The organization could be funded, equipped, mobilized. Butler asked the obvious question. What exactly were these men supposed to do? That was when the conversation moved beyond speeches, beyond the gold standard, and beyond the American Legion. MacGuire began describing a new position inside the federal government, a position powerful enough to control the machinery of the executive branch, a Secretary of General Affairs. The public explanation would be simple. President Roosevelt was exhausted, overworked, perhaps even too ill to carry out the burden of the presidency. The new secretary would step in to help him. Roosevelt could remain the public face of the government, but the new official, he would run it. Butler understood exactly what that meant. The president of the United States would remain in office, but the power of the presidency would be taken away from him. And behind this new government would stand an army of veterans, led by Smedley Butler. At least that was the plan Butler said was presented to him. But there was something Gerald MacGuire apparently failed to understand. He wasn't talking to the same Smedley Butler who had joined the Marines at 16. Because after 35 years fighting America's wars, Butler had started asking a dangerous question. Who had he really been fighting them for? By the time Gerald MacGuire approached Smedley Butler, Butler had spent most of his adult life fighting America's wars, and he had begun to reach an uncomfortable conclusion. The reasons soldiers were given for those wars weren't always the reasons those wars were fought. After retiring from the Marine Corps in 1931, Butler began speaking publicly about what he had seen. He traveled the country. He spoke to veterans, church groups, college students, anyone willing to listen. And his message became increasingly blunt. War was a racket. Not for the soldiers who fought it, not for the families who buried them, but for the corporations, banks, and financial interests that could profit from it. Butler knew this world because he had spent decades operating inside it. He had served in Haiti, where American forces occupied the country, while American financial interests gained enormous influence over its economy. He had fought in Nicaragua, where the United States repeatedly intervened to protect American strategic and commercial interests. He had gone to Mexico, where American oil and business interests loomed over U.S. policy. He had served in China, where foreign powers competed for access to markets and trade. Years later, Butler would describe his career in language almost unimaginable coming from a retired major general. He said he had been a muscle man for big business, a gangster for capitalism. Those words weren't coming from a pacifist who would watch war from a distance. They were coming from a Marine who had spent 35 years carrying it out. Butler had seen what happened when powerful economic interests wanted something overseas. Governments could be pressured. Armies could be deployed. Political instability could become an opportunity. And patriotic language could make the whole thing sound noble. Now Gerald MacGuire was sitting across from him, talking about powerful financial interests, talking about enormous amounts of money, talking about organizing veterans, talking about creating a new government position that could strip power from an elected president, while claiming it was necessary to save the country. To Butler, the pattern must have felt familiar. Except this time, it wasn't Haiti. It wasn't Nicaragua. And it wasn't Mexico. It was Washington, D.C. And the army they wanted to use wasn't the United States Marine Corps. It was an army of American veterans, with Smedley Butler at its head. MacGuire and whoever stood behind him had apparently chosen Butler because they believed his reputation could legitimize their movement. They knew veterans trusted him. They knew the public respected him. They knew he could command a room. What they apparently failed to understand was what 35 years of service had taught him. Smedley Butler knew how power operated. He knew how noble language could disguise private interests. And he knew what it looked like when wealthy men wanted soldiers to do their dirty work. He had done it for them for most of his life. He wasn't going to do it again. But Butler also knew that simply accusing powerful men of plotting against the President of the United States was an extraordinary claim. He needed evidence. He needed someone else to hear what Gerald MacGuire was saying. Someone who could investigate the story independently. So Butler turned to a reporter. His name was Paul Cumley French. And together, they decided to find out just how far this thing went. Paul Cumley French was a reporter for the Philadelphia Record. And Smedley Butler had a proposition for him. Butler told French about Gerald MacGuire. The money. The veterans. The proposed new government official. The conversations about political movements in Europe. And the plan Butler believed MacGuire had been describing. Then Butler asked French to do something simple. Go see MacGuire himself. And listen. French agreed. In September of 1934, he met Gerald MacGuire in New York. French didn't tell him he was investigating Butler's story. Instead, he presented himself as someone Butler trusted. someone who might be sympathetic to the idea. And according to French, MacGuire started talking. He spoke about veterans, money, political organization, and the movements he had observed in Europe. French testified that MacGuire talked about France, where veterans organizations had become powerful forces in politics. He spoke about the Croix de Feu, a nationalist veterans organization. And according to French, MacGuire believed something similar could work here in the United States. A movement built around veterans. A movement powerful enough to influence the government. French later testified that MacGuire told him America needed a fascist government, and that soldiers would be the men who could build it. And the ideal man to lead them was Smedley Butler. French came away convinced that Butler had not invented his story. So Butler took it to Congress. In November 1934, he appeared before a special congressional committee investigating Nazi propaganda and other anti-American activities. The committee was led by Representatives John McCormick of Massachusetts and Samuel Dickstein of New York. Behind closed doors, Butler told them everything. Gerald MacGuire was called to testify, and MacGuire denied Butler's accusations. He denied proposing a fascist movement. He denied plotting to overthrow Roosevelt. And he denied recruiting Butler to lead an army against the government. But the committee had something more than competing stories. It had evidence, bank records, letters, correspondence from MacGuire's trip to Europe, where he had studied veterans organizations, including movements with fascist characteristics. The committee investigated, and in February 1935, it issued its final report. The language was careful, but it was extraordinary. The committee said it had received evidence that certain people had attempted to establish a fascist organization in the United States. And although MacGuire denied Butler's allegations, the committee said it had been able to verify Butler's pertinent statements, with one crucial exception: the direct proposal to create the organization. But even there, the committee said MacGuire's own correspondence corroborated Butler's account. Then came the line that would follow the business plot through history. The committee concluded there was no question that such attempts had been discussed, planned, and might have been put into action, if the financial backers decided that the time was right. That matters. But so does what the committee did not prove. It did not uncover an army of 500,000 veterans waiting somewhere for orders. It did not establish that every wealthy businessman whose name had become associated with the story was part of a conspiracy. And it did not prove that Franklin Roosevelt had been moments away from being overthrown. Over the decades, the business plot grew in the telling. Names were added, connections were assumed. And sometimes, the story became a fully fledged fascist coup, ready to seize Washington, stopped at the last possible moment by one heroic Marine. The historical record doesn't take us that far, but it takes us far enough. Smedley Butler testified under oath that he had been approached about leading a massive organization of veterans that could be used to pressure the President of the United States. Paul Cumley French independently met Gerald MacGuire and testified that he heard enough to take Butler's allegations seriously. MacGuire denied it, and Congress investigated. Its conclusion was not that Smedley Butler had imagined the whole thing. It was that something had been discussed. Something had been planned. And something might have been attempted if the man financing it decided that the moment had arrived. How serious was it? How close did it ever come to happening? We may never know. Maybe the men involved were testing an idea. Maybe they were fantasizing. Maybe they genuinely believed that the Great Depression had created an opportunity to reshape the American government. Maybe the entire thing would have collapsed the moment anyone actually tried to put it into motion. But there's one thing we do know. The man that they wanted at the front of it said no. And perhaps that's the strangest part of the entire story. They chose Smedley Butler because of his past. The medals, the uniform, the reputation, the loyalty of veterans who had fought the same wars that he had. They believed that those things made Butler useful. What they failed to understand was that those wars had changed him. Butler had spent 35 years traveling the world, watching American soldiers sent in foreign countries, while powerful interests benefited from the result. He had helped enforce that system, and eventually, he had come to regret it. So when Gerald MacGuire appeared at his door, talking about money, veterans, political power, and saving the country, Butler recognized the language. He had heard versions of it his entire life. Only now, the target was his own government. Smedley Butler died in 1940. He was 58 years old. By then, Europe was at war again. Hitler had invaded Poland. Fascism had consumed much of the continent, and the United States would soon enter into another global war. But Butler would not live to see it. What he left behind was something more than the story of a general, or a whistleblower, or even an alleged coup. It was a warning that democracy does not always disappear when soldiers storm a capital. Sometimes power arrives wearing respectable clothes. Sometimes it speaks the language of stability, patriotism, security, even congressional government. And sometimes, the difference between a plan remaining a conversation and becoming something much more dangerous is the person who is asked to say yes. History gives us one advantage the people living through it never had. We know what happened next. We know what fascism became in Europe. We know what happened when the democratic institutions failed, when fear became politically useful, when violence became acceptable, and when people decided that the rules protecting democracy mattered less than defeating the people they feared. But history is only useful if we recognize the patterns it leaves behind. Fascism doesn't always announce itself by name. It doesn't have to arrive wearing a uniform or marching beneath a familiar flag. It can call itself something new. It can promise order, stability, security, and a return to greatness. And it can insist that extraordinary power is necessary because the moment is too dangerous for ordinary democratic restraints. That doesn't mean that every political crisis is fascism, and it doesn't mean history simply repeats itself. But it does mean that we should know enough history to recognize the warning signs. Because the people of the 1930s didn't know that they were living through a chapter in a history book. And neither do we. They wanted a general. They wanted a hero. They wanted a man veterans would follow. They chose Smedley Butler. They chose the wrong Marine. Thanks for watching. On this channel, we celebrate the historical figures who say no before it's too late. But what happens when fascism wins? When your government fails? When your country is occupied? And your neighbors disappear? When words lose their power? In those dark times, resistance can spark in the most improbable places. Even from two young girls, riding bicycles across the Dutch countryside. It's a pretty incredible story, and I hope to see you back here next week for it. Until then, as always, your homework is to like, subscribe, and share the video. We're slowly building a great little community here on YouTube, and I truly appreciate every one of you who joins me here each week. Until next time, this is the Underground Syllabus.